Hi, this is Eternal King here bringing you another LOR video today. So, I wanted to do an extra video. I was talking a lot about my Ryse deck, and if you don't know, the stats for this deck are currently up on Runeterra AR. This is an 80% win rate deck, so 8 out of 10 games. Currently, with the meta kind of being what it is in Eternal, this is guaranteed to win 8 out of 10 games. There are matchups you're guaranteed to lose. Ryse will always lose into a Zero Relia, my other competitive deck. It will always lose into Shrooms, so Teemo turn 1. It'll always lose into that stuff, but otherwise, it's an 80% win rate deck, 8 out of 10 games. That would make it more competitive than something like an Eddy deck, which is very competitive. The most sweaty deck imaginable is Eddy. And Ryse currently doesn't even have stats that are better than 50%, so I'm presenting, basically a 50% win rate deck or a 45% win rate deck with 80% win rate stats, thanks to my own ratioing and text selection. So I wanted to use that as like a discussion point to spring off of like my viewpoint of Eternal in general. Why is it that my takes are so different than the competitive LOR scene when it comes to what I think is good, what I think is bad, what I think is sweaty, what I think is try-hard, what I think is unmeta, and things that are essentially good deck construction versus bad deck construction. And a lot of that comes from my own personal win rates and play styles, right? So when I came out with a Zero Relia, and again, I mess around with the ratioing constantly. I've tried every variation of this particular list, but when I built Emperor's Army a Zero Relia, I had come to the conclusion that presenting a non-creature based win con in an Azir Relia deck was perhaps one of the most powerful things you could do. Obviously, Desert's Wrath being the other card that does this, along with Emperor's Dais, and essentially just allowing you to play a bunch of non-creature based slow roll win conditions in what is often considered a very aggressive deck would be very good. It would make the deck, there's basically a concept of like a brittle deck or a fragile deck construction versus a stable deck construction. Azir Relia is an exceptionally stable deck construction. Even if you're running into a terrible meta, it'll win 60% of games. If you run into a good meta, it'll win 80% of games. And I think that's the kind of range on Emperor's Army Azir Relia. Is like it's either the best deck in the game in terms of its current performance, or it's the best deck of the game that the meta is responding to and is winning a little bit less. That's the range on Azir Relia. It's never bad. There's never a bad Azir Relia meta. And I would argue similarly with my Ryse deck, there is never a bad time to play Ryse in Eternal unless everyone is just playing Azir Relia. That's really the only bad time to do that. So you end up in this sort of scenario where it's like, okay, I'm going to show you what is the best creature-based combo deck in the game, or I'm going to show you the best spell-based anti-tempo deck in the game. And like those are the two, ranges of what I think is good in Eternal from a meta perspective. But that's not how most people qualify what is a good deck. Not just in Eternal, but in LOR in general. So for example, something like Demacia Eddy, it's a staple archetype that has existed for a very, very long time. I have seen this ratioed out many different ways. It does not matter how it's ratioed out. The only thing that matters is you're running Spectral Matron and Cloud Drake and Morgana, and then, you can put in things like, sometimes you want the Fleet Feather Tracker, sometimes you want the Fiora, right? And like it just kind of depends on specifically the meta and what you're playing and that sort of thing, right? But this is typically what is seen as a competitive LOR deck. It is like the autopilot stuff, right? It is definitely the autopilot stuff in terms of like how you typically play LOR and how it's seen as competitive. Is that like good LOR is a deck that can essentially play itself as much as humanly possible. Like that is the standard of what good LOR is considered to be, is that the less feedback or input that the player has in terms of how you construct and play the list, the better. That is typically how it's done. And I kind of come out against that, right? Like, yes, it's true. It's impossible to play Eddy Demacia badly. As long as you're hitting your mobilizes and you're hitting your Gentleman's Duels and you're hitting your Morgana on 5 and your Fiora on 4 and your Cloud Drake on 6 and your Spectral Matron on 8. Like, as long as you're doing that stuff, The rest of what you do from a decision-making standpoint does not matter. Obviously, Scholarly Pioneer into landmark removal, like there's like micro decisions, but like any silver tier player could figure this stuff out. It's not like hard to play Eddy optimally. So like this is considered quote unquote the best deck in the game because of its autopilot potential. It's just like basically Mobilize, Cloud Drake, Spectral Matron, Morgana on 5, Firo on 4, usually some sort of challengers on 2 and then 3 and etc. That's quote unquote competitive LOR, and it runs exactly 6 spells. So my Ryse deck, by comparison, is running what, 6 creatures? I think max. It's actually running 4 creatures, unless if you don't count Ryse. If you count Ryse, then I guess it's running 7. So it's like an inverse of what most people consider to be good LOR. Is here I am, Eternal King, saying that I can win 80% of games with Ryse, running 7 creatures, and then the competitive scene, the top, a lot of them happen to be European players or Spanish players. They're coming in and saying that no, the best way to play LOR is to run the inverse. Instead of 7 or 6 creatures, you're running 7 or 6 spells. How do I actually feel about that? Honestly, it's 2 ways of looking at a similar equation. This is the easy way of talking about like how you play LOR. I play LOR like Hearthstone. I play my 1-drop, I play my 2-drop, I play my 3-drop, I play my Morgana on 5, my Firo on 4, and then I play my Cloud Drake on 6. And you can just curve out that way, and like literally it's Eddy. You're not going to go wrong as long as you're hitting your Spectral Matron on your Cythria and all your big stuff gets buffed. You're playing the game correctly. From a standard player's point of view. Meanwhile, on Ryse, the decision making is admittedly a lot more complicated if you want to be like a top tier Ryse player, because those simply do not exist. To be a top tier Ryse player, like an 80% win rate Ryse player like I am, you essentially have to deconstruct everything that your opponent's doing as much as possible. So when they play their 0/3 2-mana challenger, you need to Gruesome Theater it. So that's you deconstructing their play patterns. They played their 2-drop, that's very high value, you need to bounce that 2-drop. They have the 1-drop already played out, then you need to play your landmark that pings the 1-drop and kills it after you've already bounced the 2-drop, right? So like you're deconstructing their tempo. On 4, Ryse comes down, and then you're hoping that they don't have immediate way to kill Ryse. And then Ryse at least gets 1 block off and then cycles in some landmarks, or maybe he lives for 2 turns, maybe he lives infinitely. So that's huge value for you. Then you heal away any Nexus damage, you bounce anything that's too big to deal with, you steal Gale stuff. Everything is just like deconstructing tempo. They're constructing tempo with 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, 5-drop, 6-drop, 8-drop. That has been mana, reduced to be 7 mana, so really it's a 7-drop. That's their curve, right? Every Eddy player is going to curve out like that. You need to deconstruct that as much as possible if you want to be the top spell-based player in LOR. If they're playing 6 spells and 30 units, right? 34 units and 6 spells, then you need to be playing 33 spells and 7 units. And it's interesting because with the meta that we have right now, decks that kind of land in the middle are challenging. I'll give you an example. I used to be a pretty damn good Jace Lux player, right? Like I could pull out like, a 60% win rate, which is more than good enough for climbing. I'd pull out like a 60% win rate with Jace Lux, and it would just be like one of my go-tos. But Jace Lux is one of those decks that is like really not doing great right now. It's closer to like 55%. I wouldn't even call it like a proper meta list right now. And it's because it is like sitting in the middle. Is like, okay, well you have stuff like Shock Blast to remove 3 drops, but it's 6 mana, so it's very expensive. And you have Expliterator to kill something bigger, but it won't kill the really big stuff. And then you can basically chump out the board with things, but like it feels very awkward. I would say specifically right now, Jace Lux feels exceptionally awkward to play because it is one of those sort of middle ground decks. Control-based mid-range, that sort of thing. And I imagine if I was to play something like this, I would also struggle a little bit. So this is being like a mid-rangey control-based tempo shell. So you can play Sentinel on 1, then you can like Quietus something, or play Butler on 2, play Sentinel on 3, and curve out that way with a little bit of spell-based control. And then play Vex on 4. So like, yeah, this would probably be a little bit better than Jace Lux right now if I had to guess, just because it tempos out a little bit better. Even in a control shell, you want to be tempoing a little bit. So yeah, it's really just like that's kind of where we're at with Eternal, is that you're either 100% tempo with the likes of Eddie, you're 100% combo with the likes of Azir Aurelia, you're 100% control with the likes of Ryse, and or you're 100% aggro with the likes of Jinx Draven, Annie Jin, and Ziggs Poppy, etc. And I would say that that is like what Eternal is right now, is that whatever you're doing, you have to do it the maximum amount. Because if you go halfway in on a lot of the stuff, it's not going to be nearly as good as what's meta. So when it comes to standard players, yes, they understand that going all in on Eddie creature spam is the way to be good at the game, right? You just want to be all in on creature spam, creature spam, creature spam, and if I do that with mana discounts like Mobilize and Cloud Drake, then I'm probably going to have a pretty easy time winning the game. So if I do that. But when it comes to the spell-based decks, you don't see that as often right now. We saw a little bit of a resurgence with the likes of Lee Sin. So this would be closer to what I'd be talking about. But even then, they're not confident enough to take the Akshan Lee Sin deck all the way off the unit scale, right? This is still, they're playing it out like a mid-rangey shell. If you look at Sun Disc, the competitive Sun Disc we looked at previously, they're also very much unit-based with the board spam. So like a lot of standard players and a lot of the most competitive players in LOR history are exceptionally tempo-based. They do not understand how to play LOR unless it is exceptionally tempo-based or creature-based. They can't do it, and because of that, it ends up coloring their tier lists a little bit. So like again, Ryse is not on the tier list right now of Eternal. He does not exist. He is not there. He is one of the worst decks you could play in the game. But then I can show that I can win 80% of games with Ryse on Runeterra AR with this list specifically, and have it be no creatures at all, and have it be the exact opposite of everything that the competitive community kind of thinks and stands for. So yeah, a little food for thought there. I'm trying to explain like why I come at tier lists the way I do, why I explain what is good and what is not good the way that I do. Like for example, talk about ramp, right? Like standard ramp stuff. If you play ramp and you're not running 3 Field of Rush, don't bother. If you're playing ramp and you're not playing 3 Burden Nice, like don't bother. These spell-based win cons are just like, that's how you run ramp, right? And I'll also see a lot of ramp decks like not running avalanches or not running like blighted ravines and things like that, and it's just kind of like, well, don't bother. They're just playing the archetypes wrong, and that ultimately ends up hurting the win rates in the long run. But certain things have existed the way they used to exist, and they will continue to exist the way they exist currently. And that's largely thanks to Majin, right? So something like this is a heavy spell list that was popularized by Majin. It is Nora Swain, and it is just like Pie Toss ping, Ravenous Flock ping, Disintegrate ping, Drop the Bomb ping, Pokestick ping, with a little bit of creature spam with the likes of like Junk Construct and Nora and Conchologist. Again, pings and etc. etc. Cycling and Enraged Fire Spitter and Leviathan and all that. So like you do see a little bit of legacy LOR in Eternal tier lists if you look hard enough. And a lot of the time, it's actually the people who have left the game that are presenting these styles of decks. Because I don't want to say that they're definitively better at the game. Like I don't want to say that Majin or myself are just better at Eternal. It's just that we played the game long enough that we can look at LOR in a non-Hearthstone-y manner and make that work for us. And that takes more experience and more decision making. Like I would say it's much harder to pilot Nora Swain effectively as a control list than it is to pilot Eddie efficiently. Eddie is much easier to play than Nora Swain because there's just a lot more decisions being made there. And it's the same thing with Ryse, etc. Ryse also being a popular list for Majin Bay. And even when it comes to creature-based aggro decks, something like Lurk. Lurk actually has a lot of decision-making involved in terms of the way that it's supposed to be played. You know, if you're a Lurk player, you're not playing Blood in the Water, that you're probably playing Lurk wrong. If you're not playing Preservarium, you're probably playing Lurk wrong. If you're not running things like Aspire and Chronomancer and Forsaken Bakai, you're probably playing Lurk wrong. Because even in these creature-based shells that are just like straight, you know, smack-face aggro stuff, you need to be at least hand-fixing, right? Like as a bare minimum, you need to be hand-fixing, and occasionally you need to be drawing to play these decks efficiently. If you're just all in on one win con, like you're gonna not be playing Lurk properly. Which is why Lurk is actually currently sitting at like 50% win rate in Eternal. Not because it's a bad deck, but just because people play it wrong. They're just 100% not doing it correctly. They need to be on Preservarium, Chronomancer, Forsaken Bakai, etc. So even in creature-based lists, there is some finessing. They need to be on Blood in the Water, stuff like that. There is actually some finessing that has to go on with creature-based lists to make them effective, because otherwise you're just going to lose to better creature lists. Like Eddie Demacia is the best creature-based deck in the game. Therefore, every deck that is not Eddie Demacia, you know, by the logic of competitive players, is inferior. And I don't subscribe to that mentality. There are ways to build decks that are good against Eddie. Stuff like Ryse, being 100% anti-tempo into an Eddie deck, is going to mess them up pretty good. Obviously, then that basically forces people to stop running tempo spam shells and start running other things. They have to go back into the Azir Aurelia, they have to go back into the Shrooms, they have to go back into traditional LOR. So I think that's where the main difference is that like the competitive scene is whatever autopilots the most, whatever is the strongest without interaction from the player. And then the pro player scene, or the people who, you know, call them, I'm not a pro player, but I am a pro format player. The pro format players will look at like, okay, this is what you're doing. I can do the exact opposite of that and do it better than you. And that's going to be the big distinguishing factor, I think. All right, this is Eternal King, signing out.